Okay, so welcome to the March edition of the new and emerging special education teacher cadre. So today we're going to really focus on talking about accommodations and then inclusions of special populations. So we'll talk just a little bit about that, and we'll give you some resources and some materials that you can access. The first thing I'd like for you to do is each of you that are participating today, if you don't mind, just take your iPhone and scan the QR code that's on this screen so you can get signed into our Google Classroom. So we can count everybody's attendance if you don't care, please. So just take 30 seconds or so and sign in for this. Go to our next slide and just talk about accommodations. And so let's talk just a little bit. We're going to talk about an overview with accommodations. And so the accommodations are what we use, are tools and procedures that we use to give access to instruction and assessment for our students that have disabilities. And we call that, leveling the playing field. So those are what we're talking about when we're talking about accommodations. And for our students with disabilities, they may not be able to access grade level instruction or be able to participate on assessments without those accommodations. So as we think about those, we just think about what tools and procedures that we can use to help give access to instruction and assessment for our students that have disabilities.
Okay, can you guys hear me? So I was just going to talk a little bit here about the historical perspective and where it kind of comes from. In 1965, the federal government passed a law stating that they were going to give equal access for education, just like they were doing for civil rights. And out of that was born special education. And then along the lines of 2001, George Bush, the first George Bush, George W., enacted No Child Left Behind. And these acts have to be, they're education acts, so they have to be reauthorized every so many years. And out of that No Child Left Behind, we realized after a while that they helped in closing the achievement gaps and provided mandatory transparency, but there were some problematic results with that particular law. And the law focused on scores instead of growth and progress. And then under Nickleby, public school students throughout the country must participate in annual testing. So that was the residual effect, is that we started seeing all students have to be included in state testing. And state testing became a big piece starting in 2001 in terms of comparing districts, comparing states. So out of that, we have then realized that there was a need for accommodations for testing. And then the Every Child Succeeds Act loosened some of those demands on states, but did not remove accommodations for testing. So we still had that with the, and where they were also with the ESSA Act, or ESSA, they included the career and college ready piece in the testing, and then also CSI and TSI schools were a residual effect of that whole act that Barack Obama put in place to kind of ease the blow and to take some of the burden away from states in terms of how they were conducting business in regards to testing and testing students with disabilities. So out of that, we decided, we realized that accommodations were necessary to place the students with disabilities on a level playing field. And of course, while not an act, results-driven accountability is a push from OSEP right now that really focuses on not so much looking at accommodations, but looking at how students are progressing and making sure that we're doing progress monitoring when we do use those accommodations. So that's kind of that slide in a nutshell right there.
All right, thank you, Dave. So, I want to talk a little bit about the No Child Left Behind impact.
Okay, so the impact then from No Child Left Behind, students with disabilities must be provided appropriate accommodations necessary to participate in these tests. And making these determinations about the appropriate accommodations that students with disabilities need in order to fully and equally participate in large-scale testing. So there is a need to discuss this in your ARC meetings. There's a need to decide what's appropriate, and it's not something that you can do blanketly. One of the concepts that we want to get across today is that when you're having this discussion in your ARC meetings, you have to individualize it. The accommodations are not, you can't just say, okay, every child with MMD gets every accommodation. They may not need all those accommodations. So you have to have that fruitful discussion. And that should include parents when you're discussing that in the IEP and 504 meetings that you're having. So that's kind of what we see with No Child Left Behind. It really helped to push that this inclusion of special populations across the board was going to be something that we're going to make sure that's happening, or states are going to have funds taken.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll go ahead and move to this next slide, where we talk really just about trying to understand what those accommodations are.
Okay, so understand what accommodations are. Accommodations are tools and procedures that provide equal access to instruction, and they are adaptations or changes to educational environment and practices designed to help students overcome challenges with their disabilities. With this in mind, it's important to recognize that accommodations do not change what students learn, but how they learn or how they access learning. So the very key piece there is that we're not doing anything to the curriculum itself. We're testing on the same curriculum, and what students learn is the same, but how they get access to that learning is what the accommodations are providing.
Okay, thank you.
You guys, please chime in if you feel the need to do that. So here's what accommodations, here's some considerations for accommodations. They do not change the expectations for learning. They do not reduce the requirements of the task, and they do not change what the student is required to learn. So a very key piece for accommodations. That being said, teachers should provide accommodations that meet the unique needs of each individual student. Very key piece is that we do this individual by individual. So we go through the accommodations determination form and we make sure that students need these accommodations for testing. Not all students with the same disability or even those who experience the same barrier will benefit from the same accommodation. For example, not all students with visual impairments will benefit from Braille materials, but some might be better served by enlarged print or audio books.
Okay. And then we'll talk a little bit about what some examples of that might be.
Yeah, so you have a table here, you have a disability category, you see what the barrier is and what some example accommodations might look like for a particular student. Visual impairment, reading printed text would be the barrier because they can't see the text, right? So audio version of the text might be provided as an accommodation. Large print materials may be provided, or Braille materials might be provided. And in that section on IEPs, on the special accommodations page there's some questions that you ask, and there's some guiding questions in the IEP guidance document that kind of speak to, does the student need instruction in Braille first? And that would be a piece of the IEP that you're in fact designing so that the student could benefit from actually having that accommodation on the test. Then you look at specific learning disability, and the problem lots of times with kids that have SLD, the decoding of text. And so sometimes a student might need a human reader, or they may need audio books. The idea probably is that as we go forward, students with some of these lesser disabilities may in fact need just a few accommodations, but the more severe and the more intense the disability is, they may also need modifications, and we'll talk about modifications a little bit later. So when you're looking at ADHD, the difficulty lots of times with that particular problem is remaining focused, and allowing frequent breaks, marking answers directly in the test book instead of a bubble sheet. So this whole idea of giving them some type of accommodation, maybe some additional time in order to do these things so that they can remain focused and that the test is not impacted, what they're learning, and they can in fact show what they're learning without those time constraints and being able to keep themselves focused on the task at hand. Orthopedic impairment, writing out responses due to the inability to hold a pencil may permit an oral response or speech-to-text software. So depending on how difficult the impairment is, that would then in fact determine how deep the accommodation needs to be, or if there needs to be additional modifications to the in fact curriculum that you're being exposed to.
Sorry. So, and I think you probably already talked a little bit about this, Dean Paul, but this slide's talking about the barriers that inhibit access and demonstration. So you want to talk any more about that?
Yeah, the accommodations are generally grouped in the following categories. We think about, when we're talking about accommodations for instruction, how the material is presented to the student. Do we have to repeat directions? Do we have to read aloud? Do we use large bubbles on answer sheets? And then we also then think about in an overall sense, because we're looking at, there's some accommodations for instruction and there's some accommodations for testing. And in this particular instance, we're looking at the overall here. And in presentation, we might repeat directions, read aloud, use larger bubbles, answer sheet. That would be presentation. Then response would be to mark the answers in your book, use reference aids, use of the computer. And then we would also take into consideration things like time and scheduling. And then setting. We would make changes to the accommodations that we provide and make changes to the setting if that was necessary. For example, if our behavior was going to impede the learning of someone else in that testing situation, we may need to think about that, or we maybe need to think about how we're going to keep the student focused. So a study carrel would be a use that we would need. And then, do they need extended time and frequent breaks? So certainly that would be things that we would need to consider in an overall sense, both looking at instruction and looking at testing. So the whole idea of this was to look at this slide and have participants think, what's the difference between equality and equity? And you can see with equity, we're providing things that students need. We're scaffolding them. I can have a hard time getting that out. But we're scaffolding them up to the level where they're on an equal or accessible playing field. So we may have to do some things for them. And because the question sometimes kind of rise, is it fair? Is it fair to provide some of these accommodations that we're providing for these students? And if we think of it in terms of doing what they need, and we have those good conversations in the ARC meetings, then the equality takes care of itself. We're providing them with equality, but we're also providing equity in that we're putting them in a situation where they can show what they've learned.
I think that's good. I really like that graphic because I do think that kind of gives you that visual about, what is it? Some people just need those extra supports, those extra scaffolds, those extra pieces of supports that we can provide that, that gives them equal access to instruction and for our assessment. So I think we think about that for students with disabilities. I've seen that image a few different times, but I really like the way that this one is.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe a good image to share with regular education teachers. Sometimes they may not understand, well, okay, why does Johnny get a scribe or a reader or something like that? And I think that's a good way graphically to show teachers that, students may not be able to access the curriculum if everything is equal. So some need different supports. Some need individualized supports.
Yeah, and that will help them explain to the gen ed students in their classroom.
Oh, that's a good
Because
point.
normally that's where the issue lies, is that you have students that don't understand why
They
Johnny
get that.
gets to use this, but I can't use this. So it kind of helps, so it can help them explain that as well to their kids, to their peers.
I do like this. This is perfect. And this is a hot topic because like you guys have already talked about with the gen ed teachers and the students. And the big one, it seems like that they don't have a problem as much with the reader or the scribe as your behavior kids, when you want to give them a reward for being on task, for 30 minutes. And they're like, well, so-and-so is on, she's good all day long and she doesn't get a special reward. So that's a big one that that teachers, they just do not get, and they actually get very frustrated when you want to reward these what they would call kids that are misbehaving. So that's a big one for them to understand. And Vonda, do you remember when we were at the CC and when they was talking about the kids in the room? That lady was talking about how at the beginning of the year she said that she gave everybody a Band-Aid. She handed out everybody a Band-Aid, and then she gave them, they drew out a symptom or something that they had wrong with them. Like some kids drew out like a headache, and some people had a stomach ache, and some people had like a scrape on their knee. But she gave everybody a Band-Aid, and then she explained, well, is that Band-Aid going to hurt so-and-so that has a headache? No, you're going to give them something different to make their headache feel better, whereas I'm going to give you a Band-Aid to make your knee feel better. So that was kind of how she worked it with her kids at the beginning of each school year, and she said it worked really well.
Yeah, that was a really good idea. Yeah. I'm glad you thought to share that right now.
Good. So,
it's fantastic.
All right, I'll go ahead and flip to the next slide. Let's see, did I go the wrong? Sorry, Dean, but I don't mean to be going the wrong way.
That's okay. It's okay. So the whole idea, if I was doing this training in real time, I was going to have participants look at that graphic, and I was going to have them talk to one another and kind of decide what they thought that was trying to show. And then I was going to provide them with really what equity and equality is. And these are the kind of things that I come up with. Equity, that is, that they give each student what he needs to be successfully completing a given learning task or assignment. By promoting equity, teachers can break down the barriers that interfere with students' opportunity to access learning. And then equality is giving every student precisely the same thing. Now, that may be the best intention of a teacher, is to say, you know what, we're going to provide everybody the same thing in here. But we know that's not the real world. We have to meet students where they are. And so by doing so, sometimes educators will limit the opportunities of students with disability to access learning when they're really trying to do what they think is right. But we have to point out sometimes that everything can't always be equal, because students come to us with lots of differences.
Absolutely. So now we can kind of shift and talk a little bit about modifications.
Okay, so the whole idea was then sometimes we use these terms interchangeably in our profession. And so it's good to know the difference between what a modification is and what it might look like, as opposed to what an accommodation is. So we've established what an accommodation is. A modification then is something that changes what students learn. So in the previous one, the accommodation is not going to change anything that the student learns. The amount, the depth, the intensity, all those things are going to stay the same with an accommodation. But for students that have more extensive disabilities, we're going to look at possibly modifying how much they have to learn, maybe chunking it, so to speak. Maybe what students learn are used with students who require more support is something that we're going to level the playing field with accommodations, but modifications are going to change the playing field. So the playing field is going to look a lot different. Unlike accommodations, modifications do change the expectations for learning, and they do reduce the requirements of the task.
So you want to talk a little bit more about what those examples might be? I think
there's another quick one. We'll just go through that really quickly. Visual disability, reading printed text. We may come up with an alternate assignment where they're not required to read the text. Specific learning disability, decoding text, read a lower level book. So you can see we're changing what they're learning. You see the possible modification there is changing what's being learned, not putting them on a level playing field so they can learn the same thing. So ADHD, remain focused, maybe give them fewer homework questions because they can't stay on task for very long. It takes them all day to do the questions. Orthopedic impairment, writing out responses. Maybe you have a hard time with your fine motor skills and you don't have the muscle strength to complete the long assignment, so we give them a shorter report. So maybe they don't learn as much, and we slow it down a little bit, and we do it over time.
So therefore, I was thinking about, so like if the disability category, for instance, is a specific learning disability, and so you have a student with a SLD, and you offer them high level, the lower level readability, but high interest. Now, how do you think that works?
Yeah. I think that's very, very important. I think the affect part of teaching really needs to be accentuated. I think there's so much research that supports high interest, and there's so much support for that, so that the affect on the student is, the residual effect is that they're going to have interest, so they're going to read more. You see what I'm saying? So it's really a big part of it. You know, we can design great lessons. We can provide multiple means for presentation, multiple means for them to respond. But if we don't have their interest and their want to, if that's not at a high level, all that other stuff's not going to matter. So I think that's a very good point, Dion.
All right, thank you. Let's see, Dan, we'll go ahead to the next one then. Do it right? Yeah, okay, sorry about that. No. Okay, so here.
Go ahead, Dion, I'm sorry.
I just was going to introduce a slide about testing accommodations.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm just going to talk about, you know, this is when we think about accommodations and we think about assessment and testing, what do we need to know about that, Denny?
Well, you know, the first thing I think you've got to make sure and verify that the student's disability in fact matches what is being given. Okay, so if I'm coming out and I'm looking at folders, I'm going to look to see that the disability category, for example, you wouldn't give a reader to a student who was LD only in math. I think that's the most glaring one that we would make a mistake on. So we don't want to provide accommodations to the student on the test. The state is very heavy-handed about that, that we need to be verifying the disability, and there needs to be tons of support. And you know, the accommodations and modifications form on Infinite Campus that Stephanie sent me this morning ask a bunch of questions and then ask for supporting evidence. So I think we need to verify that in fact the student needs it, and we got to have data to support that. We got to have a verified disability. You need specially designed instruction. And then beyond that, I think we need supporting evidence that shows that student in fact needs that and will benefit from it. And that we've discussed that in the ARC process, and that it's ongoing, that it's an ongoing practice. That's the second part of it. So it's verified disability, ongoing practice. And that's really the crux of what we're looking for. Now, we used to go deep into those folders and look at scores. We used to go deep into the folders and look at achievement scores to see if the key piece being that the student is significantly below their same age peers in this performance. We look at a lot of places for that now. We look at how they're progressing on goals. We look at their maybe their performance on some of their probes that we're giving them in reading or math or writing. We would look at, you know, is it in fact something that we can support with data? Can we say definitively this student needs this because they have a disability intellectually or otherwise that would require this to put them on a level playing field? And we have to think about that the whole time we're doing it.
But many times, isn't that in your present level? I mean, you're talking about why that child has the problems they have in the present level underneath of academics.
Yes.
If you're looking like for a calculator, you're talking about he has trouble with conceptual understanding. You're talking about he's not able to count sequentially. He's not able to handle 3-step directions or follow that.
Sure. Sure, and some of that can be back and forth, copied and pasted. We don't like to copy and paste too much in IEP development for various reasons and for very well documented reasons. But sometimes that information in the present level is pertinent to that supporting documentation that you would put on the accommodations modifications form. And one of the things too that you could point out too is that maybe to support those accommodations that you're giving, if there's a question about it, if it's a gray area, you may want to test that child yourself with those probes without those accommodations being provided and show what the response is from the student. Show what those results are, what it looks like without an accommodation, and then what it looks like with an accommodation. So we're showing that the access is needed in order for the student to learn and make progress, because that is one of the big things that we have to say. Why are accommodations provided? So that they can make progress, so that they can learn, so that we can put them on a level playing field. And so that certainly is some of the things that we want to think about when we're reviewing testing accommodations. We don't want to give an accommodation. I used to call it the testing police. Back in the old days, they used to come out and they used to look to see if the student's disability matched what accommodation was being given on the test. And if it didn't, you were cited for that as a district. You had a citation given you. And so anyway, we want to recognize that we need to support all of our decisions for accommodations with data. And we need to show, like Stephanie was saying, she gave some great examples there of what it is that we are in fact looking at. And we can put that in two places. We can put that on the accommodations determination form, or we can put that in the present level and embed it right there in the IEP. Now, if we're talking about modifications, there's a place for that. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay.
So here's just some examples of presentation accommodations. We would use large print. This is the way we're presenting the information to the student. So we're using these accommodations to put them on a level playing field so that they can be presented the information. For example, a student that has hearing impairment may need some amplification device so that they can hear. You see, it's just kind of common sense things, but when you think about it, these are all for presentation. Next slide. These are response accommodations. This is the student, how they respond to us. So would we accommodate them so that they could respond in an appropriate way so that we can measure if in fact they are learning what we want them to learn through the goals. And those are just some examples. Anybody have anything to say about that? I jumped ahead too quickly there. I'm sorry. Now, I will point out that there's a lot of rules that are coming up, and the testing, or I'm sorry, the training that's given around inclusion of special populations. Everybody has to have that, including myself. And I'll go through, we provide that through the holler.org online. Johnny Belcher is a key person that does that for us each year, and I'm sure he's probably going to do that again. And so that training is out there, but the big difference is we're starting to see these high schools transition to online testing. So there's going to be a lot more rules that you're going to have to get your head wrapped into in terms of what.
Big roads.
Okay. So I think we've
been approved for use on a particular test. So that's something you need to really perk your ears up when you're taking that inclusion of special populations training. And that's not the point of today's topic. That's a totally different training that's going to hit a lot of different rules and regulations that you need to be well aware of if you're providing this test for special populations.
Let's see, setting. So you want to talk just a little bit then about the accommodation?
Yeah, just really quickly, we were going to reduce distractions. by changing providing physical access, will allow the student to be able to be at a certain place. We may have to change where the testing actually is occurring, and then permitting use of special equipment. So there's always those setting accommodations that we can provide some change to put them on a level playing field. And then beyond that, the next slide I think talks about timing and scheduling. Providing extended time and what's appropriate for that. If we went a little below the surface on looking at extended time, how much is too much, how much is not enough. You really look at how a student processes the information and what their pace for their learning is. If you look at the IQ score, you can look at the IQ score and you can look at that processing speed. If they're not having difficulty with processing speed, they probably don't need double time. So those are some of the kinds of things that you would look at when you're breaking those accommodations down and making sure you're doing the right thing. You want to make sure that there's a need for that extended time. And just because the student has ADHD may or may not mean that they need extended time. So that discussion needs to be an individualized one, and one that the ARC has with everybody, all the stakeholders involved, the parents, the student, and everyone, so that we know that in fact is needed. And that's not the only one. Your deficiency mentally, if you have an intellectual disability, a student with an intellectual disability, then they may in fact need extended time to process that reading. So it's not just looking at the processing speed, but it's also looking at how well they can take in information and how well they can use information. So that whole IQ is going to really speak to whether or not extended time is warranted.
Yeah, and Denny Pa, I just want to add on there that in the inclusion document, it talks about extended time, and it talks about that the student must request that extended time also. And it really gives 3 examples that the student will have the regular time, time and a half, or double time. So I just wanted to add that piece in there.
Yeah, there's different levels of time, amount of time, and so you really have to really look at that student individually and say, this is the data that supports this, and this is why this student has this. And then again, going back and testing them without that extra time may be a useful pursuit when you're doing progress monitoring, so that you can inform that present level of how important it is to have that accommodation.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to talk here about students being off task. And in the inclusion document, which may or may not have been sent to you, but you'll get a copy of it at some point. But it talks about, that extended time can be used as long as the student is demonstrating those on-task efforts. So, it's not necessarily used for students who are off task, the first hour, and then they decide to get on task the last hour. So
and that comes out in inclusion training quite a bit. They talk about that and they give a lot of scenarios around that. So you can certainly look for that. I think that's a great point that
absolutely
needed to be mentioned around extended time, because that is a popular accommodation. Almost, I'd say a high percentage of IEPs have extended time, and rightfully so, but you just need to make sure that you've got data to support it and that the student in fact is engaged.
Good point.
So could one of you talk about where you access this inclusion document at, so that we have new teachers that might want to understand where to go, like Cheryl or whoever want to talk a little bit about?
I think you can look that up on KDE if it's okay. We will send a link to that because it's kind of hard to find on KDE.
It was really hard for me to find. I just now found it, and I just went and searched for it on my phone when I was searching on my laptop.
Yeah, there's a lot of versions, Vonda.
Yeah, and we can show you the cover of the document. Some of you probably already have this document. The last date that I have is 2016 December. You might want to hold that up, Dion, but that's just a copy of the written document. It's a pretty thin document. It's probably 20 or 30 pages or something. So it's actually 35 pages. It's just a really good read, especially if you're getting deep into the state assessment and accommodations in regards to that, which of course we all do, but just give some really good tips that are really good to know. And of course we all want to do the right thing for our students, and I think that'll help make things clearer for you as you go through accommodations and modifications with
Yeah.
your students.
Yeah, and if you
Yeah,
want
you should be able to find that on KDE's assessment page.
Uh-huh.
And if you Google it, I know it's a hard one to find. It is a hard one to find. And I
if
agree.
you just Google the numbers, the call numbers,
Uh-huh.
703 KAR 5:070. That's the easiest way to find it.
Yeah, there's a hot link to it too, online as well. But also I want to point out too, not just that inclusion of special populations, there's an additional addendum now that exists out there that goes along with online testing. So that's also something that we need to be really in tune with, especially if we work at a high school, because that's coming. It's already here.
That's right. So
So-
what we'll do is when we upload this link for the Zoom meeting, we will have a column in there for resources that are relevant, and we'll try to put both of those documents in there so that you can follow up if you want some additional learning around what we're talking about. And it's good just to really get in there and take a look at these documents, know how to access them, download them on your computer at school if you need to, but just so that you have them somewhere as you're thinking about that modifications and what accommodations and modifications are, and then how do we distinguish between the two. I think those are just really important tools to have and understand.
Right.
Judy, Paul, another thing you were talking about extended time, to be able to verify that, you could also do like behavior observations or time samplings to where you have a typical peer and the peer that you're working with, and you could talk about how much of the assignment that child completed in comparison to the same time that it took the other student to complete.
Yes. Very good point.
Okay. And I think that brings us to the next slide when we're talking about the Kentucky Testing Accommodations.
Okay, yeah, I was just throwing these in because they are the ones that your choices are on the IEP, where you check a box and you say you've got this or you've got that. But I would key you to that accommodations determination form that Stephanie so kindly sent to me this morning, the supporting evidence part of that. I'll hold it up so you can see it.
Probably
I think Dion could probably bring it up.
Yeah.
just a second.
Certainly, it gives you some information about what you need to verify and what you need to be looking for in terms of those particular ones. For example, the calculator, the supporting evidence around that verified disability, which results in difficulty understanding and remembering reading material, oral and written questions, and oral communications, and the reasons the calculator was selected as an accommodation. So you have to have some verification that they need it, and there's some real rules around scribing that you need to get your head into as a result of having the inclusion training. And scribing is there's a couple of things you got to think about with scribing. Does the child have the ability to write? Fine motor skills, do they have the strength? But then also, are their basic writing skills deficient in such a way that would require some modification of having a scribe? So there's a lot of rules around that. And you language arts folks probably know a lot more about that than I would, but certainly a scribe is one that you have to really pay attention to because it can really get you down a rabbit hole. Yeah. So were you going to try to show that on your screen, Dion?
I just can't get it to work. For some reason.
That's okay. That's okay. I just know, folks out there that are listening, that when you look on Infinite Campus, each one of those on the accommodations modifications determination or the accommodations determination form, that each one has supporting evidence, and they have some really just a short blurb on guidelines about what you should be verifying and what you should be looking for.
Okay.
And did you follow on that also with manipulatives? You have to actually specify the manipulatives those children are going to be using. So if they're using algebra blocks or anything like that, that has to be discussed in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
For some kids, it could be a blank number line that they're using.
Yes, exactly. At minimum, you've got to describe why you're using it, and you have to have some data to support it. And at a minimum, you would need to answer that question. What is, an accommodations determination form should have, as a supporting piece to the conference summary, some supporting evidence that you've documented the data and that you have given the reasons why you're using that particular accommodation, and also that it's an ongoing thing, that the student has been instructed in how to use it and that you're using it, not daily, but at least it's an ongoing practice.
Yeah. So I'm trying to, sorry about that. I'm trying to bring that up. That came from Stephanie just a little bit ago, and I'm trying to find.
Now, while Dion's working on that, a good thing to also encourage as a best practice would be that the teachers that you're working with in the co-teaching situations would have some of this documentation in their lesson plans as well, so that the accommodations that are being used, you can show, if you were to have a visit from the Office of Education Accountability, that you would be able to show that those accommodations were in fact worked into a working lesson plan and that was a live document.
Yeah.
So here's what we're talking about. As you see the screen, the checkbox meets all conditions. You would have to check meets all conditions in order to use these accommodations. And as you go on, that's the first page, and you would answer all those questions. And then as you get into the particular ones, if you're looking at assistive technology, are they eligible for this accommodation? And the ARC has considered what conditions the student will use this technology on a routine basis, and evaluation information supports it, and progress data supports it, testing with and without the accommodation supports it, and then you would place some of that information down there in that supporting evidence piece. In parentheses, if you're looking at, say, for example, the one that Stephanie mentioned, if you're looking at manipulatives, down there under that it says verified disability which results in need for hands-on materials for learning and demonstrating learning, and the reason these manipulatives were selected as an accommodation. So you'd need to describe what the manipulative was, right, Stephanie?
Yes, and they're looking at, like, for algebra blocks, it could be that they have difficulty with conceptual understanding, moving that into being able to put that to abstract. And they could write that down there, especially a child with MMD that has that problem with processing and putting it to long-term memory. If they're comfortable with that, then they can put that in there.
Exactly. So another one that sometimes trips up people, if you don't care, Dion, go down to paraphrasing. And I'm getting into the inclusion training, but it kind of lends itself to that. Notice that paraphrasing is only for what? Directions. Paraphrasing shall not include defining words or concepts, teaching vocabulary, or telling a student what to do first and second. Reading passages and content passages may not be paraphrased, as that would impact content validity. So if you are paraphrasing content, you're doing the wrong thing. Your paraphrasing is only allowed for breaking those directions down for those students. It's not to be used as a replacement for reading the content.
So, we've covered a lot of material and had a lot of discussion today. Do we have any of our participants that would like to comment or ask a question or just take a second to make an observation or reflection about what we've talked about so far?
Now, one thing I do want to mention for calculator, it says plainly on there, the calculator is not used as a replacement for mathematics instruction.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's not used in place of. Right. Good.
Also, calculator, you have to mark technology as well.
Yes.
Yes.
What'd you say, Brenda? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
If you're using a calculator, you also have to mark the box technology.
Yes.
Oh, box.
That's a great point. It's a great point. And that's a technical aspect of it that sometimes in my haste I look over. So that's why I have Brenda around, because she keeps me straight.
And another point about calculators, I was just had this conversation with the instructional supervisor from Perry County, and she had been involved in this testing the past couple of weeks. And she was saying that the testing specified what type of calculator. So you might only want to just put calculator. You may need to put the type of calculator you want.
Yes, yes. There's quite a bit of that in the online, on the new online stuff, talking about the approved calculators, what's
Right.
approved, what's not approved, whether or not the state's approved it. If you're using one that's not been approved by the particular test that's being given, then you have to get, there's a permission that you have to get from the state, and you have to fill that out and send it in and get permission to use that different kind of calculator, because then you also have to verify why, what is it about this student that they would need a special calculator that hasn't been approved by the test company. Okay, so that's a great point, Vonda. Great point.
Good. Yeah. So, does anybody have anything else they want to discuss or any further? Okay, so we should be, I guess, at the conclusion of this Zoom meeting. I don't have my phone in front of me. The next meeting is going to be in April. It'll be a Zoom meeting. It'll be the second Wednesday of the month. If somebody could check that, yeah, in April.
And for you people listening out there, I'm going to be doing a little deeper training on this, and I will include a lot of the inclusion stuff with it. This PowerPoint's a work in progress. So if you want to come on March 17th up to Floyd County, we're going to have our Spring Institute, and certainly, is that right? Is that not right?
Well,
March 17th?
yeah, we're looking at that date right now, just trying to make some.
Oh, okay. So that's not set in stone yet.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. My bad.
That's all right. That's all right. But we will have that training available through
wherever we do it and whenever we do it, right?
Yes.
Let's
yeah, and
come to a theater near you
the holler.
soon. Okay. Well, my apologies.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. No, we're just talking about it, so we're trying to figure all that out. But we're trying to figure out how to get that. We're also going to try to make those modules available for anybody to access them through the holler. So all of those timely and relevant topics that we're looking for some additional professional learning on should be able to access it through the holler, and then have be able to get a certificate of completion for the work that you've done for that too. So that'll be a good